Most Ardently, Most Unknowingly in Love.
Written by P.O. Dixon. Read by Christopher. Chapter 1. Netherfield Park, October 1811. Dearest Lizzie, thank you for coming all this way to take care of me. As much as I did not wish to inconvenience you, I am delighted beyond measure to have you here. Miss Jane Bennet started sneezing into her crumpled handkerchief. The eldest daughter from the neighbouring estate, Longbourn Village, she had accepted an invitation to have tea with the Bingley sisters the day before. When she could resume her speech, she cried, "This is mortifying in every possible way." Miss Elizabeth, the second eldest Bennet daughter, threw a quick glance over her shoulder to make sure she and her sister were truly alone. Having been escorted to Jane's apartment by Miss Caroline Bingley, a young lady whose tolerance for Elizabeth was severely wanting, Elizabeth did not trust that the young woman would not be lurking just outside the door, trying to listen to whatever she could hear. Turning her attention back to her sister, Elizabeth said, "Now, Jane, surely you cannot be faulted for having fallen ill. No one plans this sort of thing. No one except our mother. She must be exceedingly proud of herself in having placed Jane in harm's way like this." "I doubt that my friends will agree with you," Jane cried. "Why would you say such a thing? What have they done? What have they said that would give you cause to believe they blame you for being ill?" "No, it is not necessarily what they have said, or even how they have behaved toward me in the aftermath of it all. I could not ask for more prodigious care than the Bingley sisters have afforded me." "Then what is the reason for your concern? Oh, Lizzie, if you could have seen the looks the two of them exchanged when I was shown into the drawing-room drenched from head to toe. They thought I did not see them. Indeed, I pretended I had not, but I know exactly what they were thinking, the same as any sensible person would think, that being, who would ride such a distance on horseback in the rain?" Elizabeth could well imagine her sister's summation of the Bingley sisters' reaction was correct, having been all too aware of the way they had regarded her when she entered the room earlier with her petticoat 6 inches deep in mud and her gown that had been let down to hide it not doing its office. Elizabeth shrugged. "Never mind what the two of them think. I am sure Mr. Bingley is delighted to have you here. In fact, I know he is. His good opinion is all that matters, is it not? If I were not beholden to his sisters for their generous invitation, I might be inclined to agree. However, as I am here at their behest and not their brother's, then I must surely give the greatest share of attention to their sentiments." Whatever were Elizabeth's sentiments on that score, she chose to keep to herself. Her primary concern was her sister's well-being, and she could not argue that the Bingley sisters had always been nothing but gracious where Jane was concerned. But how could they be otherwise? Jane's view of the world was that everyone was good and kind. Of course, she would be worried that she was imposing on the Bingleys by arriving on their doorstep in poor health. As Elizabeth's mother had stated, one does not die from a trifling cold. But as her mother had been the one to set this scheme in motion, Elizabeth was not inclined to give her credit for this sentiment. She only wished that Jane would soon be well enough to return home. If Elizabeth had her way, she would have avoided the Netherfield party in its entirety. Upon receiving Jane's missive the first thing that morning, she had meant to remain at Netherfield for a few hours at best. Hopefully she would find Jane's health significantly improved, and could later return to Longbourn with a report to that effect. Alas, such a quick escape was not to be. Instead, Elizabeth promised her elder sister that she would remain with her at Netherfield until Jane was well enough to return to Longbourn. At 6:30, Elizabeth was summoned to dinner. There she sat in the dining-room with some of the last people in the world with whom she would wish to dine. The amiable Mr. Charles Bingley, the young man at the heart of Elizabeth's matchmaking mamma's scheme. She excused from such an unenviable distinction. Elizabeth liked Mr. Bingley very much, and although her first inclination was to see her dearest sister Jane united with such a man, she was not nearly so blatant as her mother. Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. Acquaintances of short duration, Elizabeth surmised. Mr. Bingley was extremely outgoing, an amiable young man who, knowing no strangers, was able to embark upon a conversation with anyone, anywhere. She supposed he was always seeking out new and exciting adventures, which likely resulted in his hasty decision to let Netherfield Park. It had been said that he took the place within a quarter hour of seeing it. If Elizabeth suffered any uneasiness where the gentleman was concerned, it regarded his constancy. What if Mr. Bingley is the sort of man who falls in love at the drop of a hat? What if he falls out of love just as quickly? Of course Mr. Bingley would be a fool not to fall in love with my Jane. Something tells me the young man is nobody's fool. Elizabeth would not have been anywhere nearly so miserable as she was if the other two gentlemen in her party were half as amiable as Mr. Bingley, while Bingley's brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, did little to inspire any real emotion in Elizabeth. The same could not be said of Bingley's friend Mr. Darcy. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy made arrogance and conceit an art form. From almost the first moment Elizabeth laid eyes on the gentleman, his character was defined. True, he was tall and handsome, and comported himself with a noble gentleman's air, but that was hardly an excuse for the incivility that marked his introduction in the local society. Having overheard him describe her as barely tolerable, and not handsome enough to tempt him, had given Elizabeth what she relished as a reprieve from his further notice, except that no such reprieve ever manifested itself. Mr. Darcy is always looking at me, and he is just bold enough not to look away even when I catch him staring. What on earth is he about? His principal purpose had been to find fault in her, or so she told herself. Perhaps he had detected more than one failure of perfect symmetry in her form, or some other trait deemed a prerequisite among young ladies in the fashionable world. However, the more they were thrown into each other's path, the less her earlier supposition held sway. He had gone from observing her in silence to engaging her in debate, often heated at that. Her courage always rose at every attempt to intimidate her, and Elizabeth was sure Mr. Darcy meant to test her every time the two of them spoke. When dinner was over, Elizabeth returned directly to Jane, who was sleeping soundly. Now, alone in her room and preparing herself for bed, Elizabeth sighed. Thoughts of Mr. Darcy's odd behaviour would not be repressed. If she tried to dissect every look and every word she had exchanged with Mr. Darcy, she would be up all night. Still, some reflection on the events of the evening must be had. Elizabeth always fancied herself an excellent studier of people, and rarely had her talent been on such heightened display as it was that evening with the Netherfield party. For all intents and purposes, Miss Caroline Bingley was the embodiment of all that was deemed most admirable in the society in which she was raised. Educated in the best private seminaries her family's fortune allowed, she had long forgotten the source of said fortune, or so it would seem. She thought meanly of those whom she deemed beneath her in circumstances. Caroline was far too aware of her circumstances not to strive for even more money and status. It was a particular predilection of hers to dismiss anyone who posed a threat to her desire to make an extraordinary match with the young master of Pemberley in Derbyshire, Mr. Darcy. For young ladies of her ilk, appearance as well as accomplishments were everything. Thus she excelled in every way a proper young woman ought to. She prided herself in having a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages. Why, she even boasted of being well read, an assertion that bore absolutely no truth so far as Elizabeth was concerned. In so many ways, she was everything that Elizabeth was not, and despite her advantages she barely tolerated Elizabeth. The latter did not have to search her mind for very long to ascertain the reason for the former's ill opinion of her. For whatever reason, Miss Bingley likened Elizabeth to a contender for Mr. Darcy's attention. Why else was she always putting herself forth as a third in what Mr. Darcy intended as a conversation for two with Elizabeth? On the other hand, Miss Bingley does like to be the centre of attention whenever she can help it, which poses a more significant question. Why is Mr. Darcy always trying to engage in conversation with me at all? Thoughts of one of the Bingley sisters could not help but encourage thoughts of the other to intrude. Mrs. Louisa Hurst's character was not as easily discerned as was her sister's. Louisa varied from being sincere one minute to insincere the next. Elizabeth impugned a similar dichotomy to the lady's temperament, self-assured one moment and insecure the next, as though she was deferring how she ought to think and how she ought to feel to the will of others. What a pair the two of them were, Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst. They complemented each other, and not in a good way, in much the same manner as Elizabeth's younger sisters, Kitty and Lydia, complemented each other. Between the former pair, Miss Bingley was by far the more awful of the two. Elizabeth was sure that if she had met the older sister outside the company of the younger, she would tolerate her particularly well. So long as they were a pair, Elizabeth wanted nothing to do with the Bingley sisters, and she could hardly wait to be away from Netherfield. Chapter 2. Although Jane was sure she had imposed on their generous hospitality long enough, especially with her falling ill on the heels of her arrival, her new friends, the Bingley sisters, were ever so cordial toward her, as well as accommodating. On that particular evening the ladies were visiting Jane in her room. Their reasoning had been that so long as Jane could not come to them, they would gladly go to her. When it was mentioned that the gentlemen were once again dining with the officers, Miss Bingley expressed her doubts. "I suspect that gambling, drinking port, and smoking cigars are truly the order of the evening." Mrs. Hurst nodded her head. "Of that there can be no doubt, but you know our brother Charles. He's always just as eager to part with his money as he is to give away his heart. I declare I have never met another young man who is always falling in love wherever he goes." Jane could only wonder if her friend's assertion was meant for her. She was silent. The younger sister said, "Oh, you will get no argument from me on that score. One would think our dear brother would follow Mr. Darcy's lead. He never allows his head to be turned." Here she smirked. "Not even by a pair of fine eyes," she concluded. Placing her hand on Jane's, she said, "My brother likes you, but I would not read too much into his affections if I were you. Charles is of an age where his acquaintances are always increasing. He is always falling in love with one young lady or another, but I can say with certainty that his constancy is just as lasting as a drop of rain. I suspect there is but one young lady of his acquaintance capable of garnering truly lasting regard in my brother's eyes. It is a good thing Miss Darcy is as constant as she is, else my brother might be in grave danger of losing her heart," said Mrs. Hurst. Here Jane could no longer hold her tongue. "Miss Darcy?" The elder sister nodded. "Yes, Miss Georgiana Darcy. I really do not think she has her equal for beauty, elegance, and accomplishments, and the affection she inspires in my sister and me is heightened into something still more interesting. Whenever we are all together, either at Pemberley or in London, it is all our brother can do not to admire her. We can scarcely wait until we can call her our sister." As this was Mrs. Hurst speaking and not Miss Bingley, who was wont to embellish, Jane could not help but feel ill. This the younger woman detected. "Dearest Miss Bennet, you look ill. I hope it is not because of what we are discussing. We were both of the opinion you knew that Miss Darcy and Charles are destined to be married." She reached for the glass of water on Jane's bedside table, no doubt intending to offer it to her guest, but Jane declined the gesture with a slight wave of her hand. Miss Bingley continued, "Why, it is the favourite wish of both our families. Everyone who knows us knows it to be true." She looked at her sister. "Is that not correct, Louisa?" "It is indeed," Mrs. Hurst replied, standing. "But perhaps we should not have said a word. Poor Miss Bennet, you really do look ill." She turned to her sister. "Come, Caroline, let us leave our guest to rest. I fear we have prevailed on her long enough." Caroline Bingley stood. "Of course. Pray accept our apologies if we caused you any distress, my dearest Miss Bennet. I assure you it was unconsciously done. Oh, do get some rest. I am sure you will feel much better tomorrow." After furtive glances on both their parts, the Bingley sisters took their leave. For the first time in her life, Jane was almost tempted to think meanly of someone. Such a sentiment was fleeting, however, for why would Mr. Bingley's sisters wish to injure her with speculation and innuendo? No, if both sisters agreed that an alliance between their brother and Miss Darcy was destined, then surely it must be more than wishful thinking. Surely it must be true. Oh, why on earth did I allow myself to be cast into such a situation as this? A young woman from a small country estate, entailed away from the female line, and from a family with no fortune and no connections, dare not stand a chance against the likes of Miss Darcy. Jane buried her head beneath the covers. I do not know that I have been so embarrassed in all my life. The notion that she had somehow been complicit in her mother's matchmaking scheme could not help but bolster her self-recriminations. Lizzie would never have allowed Mamma to send her on such a foolish endeavour, nor would Miss Georgiana Darcy behave so recklessly, I'm sure. Jane fought the urge to cry, for she was sure she was half in love with Mr. Bingley already. It had been years since she had allowed herself to entertain such fanciful notions. Not since the young man from town had shown more than a passing interest in her. He even wrote her a nice poem. In truth, Jane could barely recall the amiable young man's name. She surely had no recollection of how he looked. But as for his poem, those words she would never forget. What more does the heart of mortal man desire, but to admire, but to yearn, but to love and to be loved in return. Alas, nothing came of it. Before that, Jane and her sister Elizabeth had sworn to each other that only the deepest love would tempt them to marry. Such sentiments she had long since buried in the wake of the young man's defection, only to have them resurface once more, and at a time when, according to the Bingley sisters, all hope must surely be in vain. The tears she had been holding back flooded Jane's eyes, and she cried and cried until she fell asleep. Seeing Miss Jane Bennet outside her apartment at that hour of the night wandering the halls of Netherfield was a cause for considerable alarm for the amiable master of the house, Mr. Bingley. He hurried to her side. A closer view gave the young man even more reason for concern. From the looks of things, the young woman was in no state to be wandering about outside her room. Her complexion was pale and her countenance was sickly. He had to admit that he had not expected her to look that way. In his eyes, she was the loveliest woman in the whole world. At that moment, she seemed like the most helpless young woman in the entire world. "Pardon me, Miss Bennet," Bingley said, catching her attention. Jane ceased ambling along the corridor, braced her hand against the wall for support, and turned to look at him. Her angelic eyes bore a muddled mixture of embarrassment and confusion. "Mr. Bingley," she replied in a low, sickly voice. Jane covered her mouth with her other hand and started to cough into her handkerchief. This only served to alarm the gentleman even more than he had been previously in seeing her outside her room, wandering the halls. The house had settled for the evening long ago. No one ought to be awake at such an hour, not even a footman. Thinking Miss Bennet might be unable to bear her own weight amid the onslaught of her incessant coughing, Mr. Bingley placed his arm about her shoulder, trying to offer her some support and much-needed assistance. "You must allow me to aid you in returning to your room," he said. "You do not look well, and I fear you might collapse right here in the hallway." "My sister," Jane said. She averted her eyes to the end of the hallway to where Elizabeth had said she was staying. "I was hoping to see my sister. I need her." The young man nodded, somewhat appeasingly and somewhat concerned. "And I shall make sure that she is aware that you would like to see her," he responded to Miss Bennet's plea, even though he was not sure how he would do so at that hour. The thought that he might prevail on his sister Caroline at such a time as this entered his mind and quieted his concerns. "But first, we must attend to your safety, which means you must return to your room." Jane shook her head as best she could. "No, sir," she began. "I cannot impose on you in this way. I fear I have inconvenienced you and your sisters long enough. However, you are correct. I ought not to be out of bed so soon. I fear I overestimated myself. If you see that my sister Lizzie is aware of my urgent desire to see her, then I shall be in your debt. As for returning to my room, I shall manage on my own." "Are you certain you can manage on your own? I assure you it is no trouble. It pains me to see you in such a state when I can rectify it in a matter of minutes. No, again, I cannot ask such a thing of you." "If that is truly your desire, then I have no choice other than to oblige," he said, allowing his arm to fall to his side, albeit reluctantly. Jane tried to smile. "You are very kind, sir. If it is all the same to you, I think I shall walk along beside you until you are safely inside your room, and then I shall have your sister summoned to your side." Bingley was nothing if not kind and considerate of others. There really was nothing he would not do to help someone in need. He would even behave recklessly or without concern for consequences. He would do whatever needed to be done. These particular aspects of his character were but some of the many things that made the young man so endearing. Once alone in her room, Jane's first impulse was to chastise herself for her haste, in wanting to see Elizabeth to confide in her what Mr. Bingley's sisters had been going on and on about earlier that evening. What was I thinking? It is not in my nature to behave so recklessly. Vanity was not in her nature either. Yet Jane could not help but glance in the mirror out of concern for how she must have looked to Mr. Bingley. She shuddered at this picture of herself, her unkempt hair, her pale, sickly complexion, her loosely tied robe. What was I thinking in chancing that anyone would see me this way? Especially Mr. Bingley. She certainly admired Mr. Bingley for his kind-heartedness and his unwavering goodness. She too had a penchant for putting the needs of others before her own needs, which is why she was immediately sensitive to how Mr. Bingley's coming to her service at that hour, and under such circumstances as the two of them were facing, might be perceived by someone bent on misinterpreting purely innocent gestures. On the other hand, Mr. Bingley's accompanying her to her apartment was anything but appropriate, and therefore was not innocent. Young men did not escort single women to their apartments at any hour. To do so would be to compromise the young lady's reputation, the retribution of which could be any number of undesirable consequences, one such consequence being a forced marriage between the two parties. Jane liked Mr. Bingley too much to see him forced to endure such a fate. Now, safely back in her own bed under her own volition, she whispered a silent prayer that her late-night chance encounter in the hallway with Mr. Bingley had gone undetected. Chapter 3. Having looked in on Jane some hours earlier and finding her sister fast asleep, Elizabeth went directly to the library. She knew the gentlemen were away for the evening, purportedly dining with the officers, and thus Elizabeth felt reasonably assured she would have the room all to herself. Burying one's head in the pages of a good book had a way of making one lose track of time. What a surprise it was to Elizabeth upon looking up and seeing Mr. Bingley's proud friend enter the room. "Miss Elizabeth," Mr. Darcy said, bowing slightly, "I did not think I would find you here." Being in a playful mood, as a consequence of a passage in the book in her hand, Elizabeth replied, "Oh, where did you think you would find me, sir?" Rather than appear a tall, brooding gentleman seemed alarmed. "No," he quickly responded, holding up his hand almost apologetically. "What I meant to say is I did not expect to find you here at this hour. It is very late." Using her finger as a bookmark to remember her place, Elizabeth closed her book. Having sat for so long in the same attitude, she adjusted her position in her large velvety chair by tucking her foot underneath herself. Half smiling at the gentleman, she said, "You really do not like being teased, do you, Mr. Darcy?" In saying as much, Elizabeth was referring to a prior conversation she had suffered with Mr. Darcy and Miss Caroline Bingley in the drawing-room. "Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at," Elizabeth had teased. "That is an uncommon advantage, and uncommon I hope it will continue, for it would be a great loss to me to have many such acquaintances. I dearly love to laugh. Miss Bingley has given me more credit than can be. The wisest and the best of men, nay, the wisest and best of their actions, may be rendered ridiculous by a person whose first object in life is a joke," he then replied. "Certainly there are such people, but I hope I am not one of them. I hope I never ridicule what is wise and good. Follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies, do divert me, I own, and I laugh at them whenever I can. But these, I suppose, are precisely what you are without. Perhaps that is not possible for anyone, but it has been the study of my life to avoid those weaknesses, which often expose a strong understanding to ridicule, such as vanity and pride. Yes, vanity is a weakness indeed, but pride, where there is a real superiority of mind, pride will be always under good regulation. Your examination of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume, and pray what is the result?" Miss Bingley had asked. "I am perfectly convinced by it that Mr. Darcy has no defect. He owns it himself without disguise." No doubt remembering their conversation as well, the gentleman cleared his throat. "As I said then, I cannot forget the follies and vices of others so soon as I ought, nor their offences against me." Elizabeth nodded. "You concluded with the words, 'My good opinion once lost is lost forever,' I believe. Your point being, Miss Elizabeth?" "My point is that if I am not careful, I may risk your censure for the remainder of all time. That is to say, if I have not done so already." This last statement served to draw Mr. Darcy further into the conversation, as well as to the part of the room where Elizabeth sat. "Why would you say that, Miss Elizabeth?" Here Elizabeth threw a quick glance about the library. "Did the two of us not spend nearly a half-hour in this very room just this afternoon, during which you did not utter a single word to me? Why? I am sure you did not look at me even once." Mr. Darcy arched his brow. "The same might be said of you, Miss Elizabeth. I do not recall your having spared a single glance in my direction either. But, sir, how would you know if I looked at you or not? What with your own steadfastness to your purpose of not looking at me? Your point is well taken, but as I recall, you did not utter a single word to me either. What say you now?" "I say a lady must not speak unless spoken to." As though he forgot the purpose of coming to the library at such a late hour, Mr. Darcy gestured to the seat closest to Elizabeth, a silent request to sit with her to continue their discussion. "You have an answer for everything, do you not?" Having taken his seat, he leaned closer to hers. "Indeed, I had resolved upon entering the library earlier that I would not be having intercourse of any kind with you. You looked so contented reading your book. I dared not interrupt you. Now it would seem that you too have an answer for everything. Are we not the two most compatible people in the room? I suspect the two of us have far more in common than either of us supposes, and as you are nowhere near as engaged in your book now as you appeared to be earlier, I would like nothing better than to explore the complementary aspects of our characters. Who is to say what we may discover about each other before the night is over? Elizabeth placed her book aside on the nearby table. That, sir, seems like a challenge. One that I hope you're willing to accept. I, for one, have nothing better to do this evening, although you may opt for a less daunting means of passing the time. I'm not afraid of you, Mr. Darcy. Not even a little afraid, Miss Elizabeth. Elizabeth cleared her throat. She cleared it again. Should I be? She asked, her voice an odd mixture of curiosity and scepticism. Mr. Darcy stood. You seemed parched. Shall I pour you a drink? As for myself, I believe one is in order. She nodded. I will have whatever you're having, sir. Until that moment, barely unnoticed by Elizabeth that there was a liquor cabinet in the room. She could only suppose it was there strictly for Mr. Darcy's convenience, for the Bingleys never entered that part of the house as best she could tell. She watched in wonder as Mr. Darcy went about the business of preparing their drinks, and for whatever reason, she could not help but be intrigued. Here was a man whom she supposed never lifted one finger to do anything. Not that she thought he was lazy, but rather because he was so wealthy. Her own family was by no means poor, but by Mr. Darcy's standards the Bennets were not even rich. Moments later, Mr. Darcy stood before her with two snifters in hand, one for her and one for himself. Their eyes were fixed on each other's when he handed Elizabeth's drink to her. The slight brush of their hands against each other's during the exchange caused Elizabeth to feel as though she was already suffering the effects of her drink, and she had not taken a single sip. She smiled, nodded her thanks, and promptly raised her glass to her lips. She took a long, slow sip, closing her eyes tightly as the hot amber-coloured liquid went down her throat. By now Mr. Darcy had resumed his former attitude, although she could swear their seats were just a little closer than they were before. Elizabeth raised her glass to her lips once more. Mr. Darcy asked, Shall I bring the decanter over and place it on the table? Elizabeth brushed her lower lip with her tongue, a consequence of being in the middle of her next sip. Listen to you, Mr. Darcy, teasing and taunting. Once you get to know me better, Miss Elizabeth, you will realise that I give as good as I get. Elizabeth was not unaffected by his manner of looking at her. She said nothing, which no doubt encouraged him to say more. I imagine you feel the same as regards your own ability to give and take. She raised her glass, and the gentleman did likewise. Clicking her glass to his, Elizabeth said, And so it begins. Are you quite certain you are up to this, Miss Elizabeth? Do you mean to intimidate me, sir, with such a question? You ought to know that my courage always rises with any attempt to intimidate me. As does my own, I assure you. Then we shall both consider ourselves forewarned. Elizabeth took another sip of her beverage. Where shall we begin in the first step towards our journey to discover all that we have in common, Mr. Darcy? Well, being that we both have a penchant for spending time in libraries, perhaps we might start with books. Elizabeth shrugged. We might start there. We are in a library, after all. It is certainly a fitting subject, but I suspect once we embark upon such a discussion as that, we might be here all night and well into the next day. Surely you did not intend to spend the entire evening inside this room, sir? Not entirely. Then where should you like to begin, Miss Elizabeth? Do not mistake me, sir. I would very much like to continue this line of discussion, particularly as it concerns this particular room. What about this particular room? I will not argue that you love to read. Doing so is the very essence of a consummate gentleman, and I dare say you are nothing if not consummate. I think there is a compliment in your speech, Miss Elizabeth, and therefore I feel obliged to thank you. Elizabeth nodded. A compliment indeed. It is my pleasure, sir. More to the matter at hand, tell me I am not wrong to suspect your desire to spend copious amounts of time inside this room is a consequence of your wanting to be beyond Miss Caroline Bingley's reach. Mr. Darcy laughed a little at this conjecture. I cannot argue your point. I know her well enough to know she is the last person in the world I might expect to see in this room. Were it not for Bingley's library, I do not know that I would have found my time spent here in his home nearly so tolerable. His use of the word tolerable struck a particular chord with Elizabeth, and she supposed that now was as good a time as any to introduce the subject. "Pardon me, Mr. Darcy, what is this fondness you have for that particular word, tolerable?" "That is an odd question. Would you care to elaborate?" "Do you not recall telling Mr. Bingley the night of the Meryton Assembly that you found me barely tolerable and not handsome enough to tempt you?" Mr. Darcy coloured. "I did not mean for you to hear me say such a thing, Miss Elizabeth. How can I make amends for such an ungentlemanly remark? Are you saying that you meant what you said, but you did not mean for me to hear what you said? Because it sounds to me that the latter is true. The latter is certainly true, but not the former. Not by any stretch of the imagination, I assure you." "Mr. Darcy, I am confused. Do you or do you not find me tolerable?" "Miss Elizabeth, it was not long after I met you that I realised you are one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance. Does that put an end to your confusion?" "It is certainly a pleasing start, but I'm still rather perplexed." "How might I end your suspense, Miss Elizabeth?" Mr. Darcy asked, leaning closer and resting his hand atop hers, the same hand that she had resting in her lap. Elizabeth was almost afraid to ask her next question, but as it was on the tip of her tongue, she proceeded. "My question is, do you believe me to be handsome enough to tempt you, sir, or do you not?" she asked, moving her hand from her lap to the armrest of her chair. "I think you know the answer to your own question." "I think I should like to hear you speak the words, Mr. Darcy. I am of the opinion that actions speak louder than words." Mr. Darcy reached for her glass. "Let me pour you another. That is, unless you suppose you have reached your limit for one evening." Elizabeth handed the gentleman her glass. "I shall not allow you to escape answering my question as easily as that, Mr. Darcy." He stood and went to the liquor cabinet. "Are you certain I do not need to bring the decanter over to the table, Miss Elizabeth? I have a feeling we are going to be here for quite a while. If you continue to evade all my questions so well as this, you may have a point, sir." Without saying a word, he refilled both snifters. With both glasses and the decanter in his hands, he returned to Elizabeth's side. After setting the crystal decanter on the table, he handed Elizabeth her drink. Once again, their fingers brushed against each other's, only this time the two of them lingered a second or two longer than was necessary. Elizabeth could only wonder if what she was feeling, the gentleman was feeling too. "Are you certain that you are a connoisseur of fine cognac, Miss Elizabeth? This is from my private stock. You may be unaccustomed to its effects. Dare I be accused of plying you with fine liquor and then having my way with you?" "You need not concern yourself on that account, Mr. Darcy, I assure you. It is not as though I have never imbibed brandy before tonight," she said, raising her freshened drink to her lips. "Yes. Well, there is brandy, and then there is cognac. This young woman is not just cognac, but, as I said, it is from my private stock. I wonder at the distinction, sir. Are cognac and brandy not the same? It is certainly true that all cognac is brandy. Not every brandy is cognac. There are rich distinctions inherent in the latter, which makes comparing the two akin to comparing champagne to wine. Whereas brandy is made all over the world, every cognac is made in the cognac region of France. Hence your reasoning for travelling with your own stock. Is there anything else that you bring along with you, Mr. Darcy, other than the usual things? You would be surprised, Miss Elizabeth. Test me, she teased. What about books? Is there a secret stash hidden somewhere in this very room, owned by you and reserved for your own particular pleasure? Or perhaps you keep them in your apartment? A particular pleasure that I would be happy to share with you. In your apartment, Mr. Darcy? How scandalous, she cried before taking another sip of her drink. Well, we would not want that, would we, Miss Elizabeth? What say you that I bring one of the books from my private library with me the next time we meet here in the middle of the night? As intriguing an offer as that is, who is to say there will be a next time? Only you can say, my philosophy is, there is always a next time. At any rate, I often come here during the late hours of the night, just in case you ever wish to know. I shall take your words under advisement, Mr. Darcy. Leaning forward, Mr. Darcy reached for the decanter. Will you be having another, Miss Elizabeth? Or have you reached your limit for one evening? I do not know that I have a limit, Mr. Darcy. Is that something you would advise? Generally, everyone ought to establish a limit in one matter or another. It is what keeps us safe from harm. Pray tell me what is one of your limits. Perhaps it is yet another shade in our characters that we share. Actually, I have a limit where imbibing cognac is concerned. which is the reason I intend for this to be my last one for the night." "Oh, but I thought we agreed the night is young." "If you insist. I'm afraid I must, for you have yet to answer my earlier question. Ask me again." "My question is, do you believe me to be handsome enough to tempt you, sir, or do you not?" At length he said, "You more than tempt me, Miss Elizabeth." After taking a long sip from his refilled glass, he leaned closer to her once again. "The question remains, do I tempt you, Miss Elizabeth?" "Well, sir, I have never uttered such words against you, which renders your question a moot point in my estimation." Darcy leaned closer. "Then allow me to rephrase the question. Do you want me to tempt you?" "Mr. Darcy, there can be only one answer to your question." "An answer for me to discover?" he asked, his voice tentative yet teasing. "An answer to defer? Am I not allowed such a prerogative?" "You are undeniably allowed such a prerogative, Miss Elizabeth. I am your humble servant." Elizabeth breathed a silent sigh. Finally her heartbeat's pounding ceased. Never had she shared such daring intercourse with a member of the opposite sex. There was something about being alone with Mr. Darcy, and imbibing fine brandy at that hour of the night that made her eager to throw caution to the wind. A part of her whispered she ought to excuse herself from his company and return to her apartment. Another part of her whispered, "Surely one more glass will not hurt. Soon enough Jane will be well, and the two of us shall return to Longbourn." When would Elizabeth ever have the chance to enjoy Mr. Darcy's company again? She liked this side of him very much. She was sure she might never see it again. "I know that ascribing oneself as a humble servant is the thing to do, but surely you know that it is ironic when you speak this way." "Are you suggesting that I am disingenuous?" He clutched his chest. "You injure me, Miss Elizabeth." "No, I'm not saying that, Mr. Darcy. I'm merely pointing out the irony. Aside from your friends from town, I do not know a single person who does not think you are haughty and arrogant." She bit her lower lip. "No, there is one person whom I must exclude from your long list of critics. My sister Jane, for she believes the world in general is good." "What do you believe, Miss Elizabeth?" "About the world in general? About me in particular?" "Now that I know that you think I am one of the handsomest women of your acquaintance, there can be only one answer to your question." "It sounds to me as though you're once again exercising your prerogative to defer answering my question, which hardly seems fair." "How does it not seem fair? Have I not been forthcoming with you?" Here Elizabeth placed her hand on top of his, but only for a moment before remembering herself. "You have been forthcoming with me. I shall endeavour to be equally frank with you." Oddly enough, this picture of herself wounding the man whom she had professed to hate for all eternity mere weeks before did not sit well with her at all. She placed her hand atop his again. "Sir," she began, "my feelings on the subject now are nothing at all as they were when you first entered the room. This brief adventure of ours has given me insights into your character, the likes of which I could not have imagined." Once again she remembered to remove her hand from atop his. His countenance taking a delightful turn, Mr. Darcy raised his glass. "The night is young. Where shall we journey from here?" "Let me think," Elizabeth said. "What else do we have in common?" "Oh, so far as I know, we only have sisters. We might talk about that." Darcy nodded. "So far as I know, that is true. Neither of us has brothers, which, unless I am mistaken, presents quite a conundrum for your family." Elizabeth feigned confusion. "How does my not having a brother pose a conundrum for my family, Mr. Darcy?" Mr. Darcy raised his hand to his mouth and began tapping his fingers about his lips. He regarded Elizabeth intently. Once again, her heartbeat sped up under the weight of his stare. At length he said, "Why do you do that, Miss Elizabeth?" Her eyes begged the question of what he was referring to, even though, deep inside, she knew precisely what he meant. Elizabeth shifted a little in her seat. He reached for her hand. Upon seizing it, he said, "I will not allow you to escape this discussion. Having no brother who stands to inherit your father's estate must indeed weigh heavily on your mind." Elizabeth did not withdraw her hand from his. His touch was so soothing to her, and for reasons she could not make out. "If I am to be honest with you, sir, then I would have to say I do not allow myself to think about it. My mother worries enough about the entail on my father's estate for all of us. But surely you cannot always avoid thinking about what would happen were an ill-timed fate to befall your father." Elizabeth drew a deep breath. The thought of losing her beloved father was too much to bear. The matter of the entail, and what would become of her mother and her sisters and even herself, merely compounded the pain which they must inevitably suffer. There was not a single one of her family who would not be inconsolable in the aftermath of a fate that could befall them in the blink of an eye, a single heartbeat. Whether it was the brandy or the sound of his voice or some intoxicating mixture of the two, Elizabeth could not say. Her breathing grew shallow, her eyes threatened to pool with tears. Observing this, Mr. Darcy stood, and still holding Elizabeth's hand, he gently coaxed her to her feet and led her to the sofa where they sat down beside each other. In an instant he took Elizabeth in his arms. Elizabeth surrendered herself over to his care and rested her head on his chest. With both of his arms wrapped around her, he held her close. "I did not mean to upset you," he said, his tone reassuring. "I am not upset," Elizabeth whispered, hoping her voice would not contradict her assertion. "We do not have to speak further on this subject." "Another exercise of prerogative on my part, Mr. Darcy. How you indulge me." Mr. Darcy's ensuing silence prompted Elizabeth to regret her attempt at levity. Had he not gently reproached her for doing something similar mere minutes earlier? "I don't mean to be so evasive, sir. It is just that some things I cannot bring myself to talk about. The entail on my father's estate is one of them." "Then let us not talk about it," he murmured. Elizabeth's head still rested on Mr. Darcy's chest. His heartbeat was keeping pace with hers, and hers was racing. She pulled away just enough to study his face and saw instead his eyes gazing into her own. His eyes drifted from her eyes to her slightly parted lips and back to her eyes. Hers traced a similar path. She swallowed hard. "Then what shall we talk about?" "Let's not talk." Thank you for listening to
Most Ardently, Most Unknowingly in Love, Chapters 1 through 3.
Written by P.O. Dixon. Read by Christopher. If you have enjoyed this story thus far, and I hope you have, you will not want to miss what happens next. Subscribe to this channel today and be among the first to be notified when
Most Ardently, Most Unknowingly in Love.
The complete audiobook is available for your listening pleasure. Your likes, subscribes, comments, and shares help this channel grow.
To further encourage these stories, consider joining this channel. Members receive exclusive perks, including minimal ads during early access periods. Existing members, heartfelt gratitude for your support.